Hello everyone, nice to see you again. It feels like a long time since I've spoken to you all. This week we're going to focus on chapters 28 to 34 in Great Expectations. There won't be an essay this week, it's pretty much note-taking, following the plot, because there's lots of threads in the air at this point, right in the middle of the novel, and making sure we're really up to date with Pip and everything that's going on in the book. So there's certain things you need to do this week, even though there's no essay. It's really important you read these 50 pages of the novel. You also need to read pages 35 to 39 of your York Notes Great Expectations guide. You need to read the summary of this section in the Word document that I've sent you. And then you need to make notes on this section using the questions as prompts, which are underneath. There's 5 questions, and then the 6th one is to create a summary flowchart. And then finally, there's a long article called A Feast for the Senses. I've blanked quite a lot of it out, but if you want to read the whole thing, you can. But I'd like you to read the sections that I've left in black, particularly the exploitative parent-child relationship section, which we can really see with Miss Havisham and Estella in this section of the book, and we also see with Magwitch and Pip throughout the book on a greater scale. So, if you remember, the last chapter that we encountered together was Joe's visit to London and Pip's quite bad hosting of him. What we see at the start of chapter 28 is in response to Joe's message that Pip has been invited back to Satty's house to see Estella. So we're going to go through the chapters, and I'd like you to make notes as we go along, and you can always pause and sort of catch up as we go through. So chapter 28 first. So Pip returns home by coach, and the main thing we see in this chapter is the coincidence whereby he bumps into the strange man who gave him the 2 £1 notes in the pub not all those years ago. The main thing here is this patterning that Dickens uses, and what I'd call locational patterning. Pip often returns back to the marshes or returns back to Satty's house at times when he's not sure what to do or at times of distress. So he's making this return back to his sort of paradise-like sort of countryside of birth, the Kent marshes, away from the sort of grips of London, but he's always sort of toing and froing between the 2 locations. And Pip again is battling with his conscience about Joe. We saw his behaviour towards Joe when Joe visited London. Now Pip should be going to visit Joe back at home, but he talks himself out of it and he fails to visit Joe, opting instead to stay at the inn, and never actually goes to see Joe at all. And we see that whenever Pip has hopes, such as in this chapter with meeting Estella and believing he's destined for her, ultimately his childhood haunts him, and it's this convict from his childhood and his coincidental appearance which reminds Pip of his sort of guilt and shame and the criminal connections in his past. As we move into chapter 29 then, which is quite a long chapter, there's a word I'd like you to remember or learn if you've never seen it before, and that word is vicariously or vicariously, depending on how you pronounce it. To live vicariously, let me give you a couple of examples. If you can imagine parents that dress their children up for like beauty pageants and are really sort of competitive and sort of winning first prize in the beauty pageant, or the parent who sort of forces their child into sort of playing Sunday League football and is sort of shouting and screaming at them and sort of celebrating as though with their own successes. That's living vicariously. It's when you live out your own dreams and ambitions through somebody else because you weren't able to. So Miss Havisham lives vicariously through Estella because Miss Havisham was jilted and was unable to marry, and so she lives her dream of sort of wreaking revenge on all men by getting Estella sort of trained up. And Magwitch lives vicariously through Pip by funding him to be a gentleman, the life that he can't have as a convict. So Pip sees himself as a romantic hero in this chapter, but all the conditions are against him. We've got Orlick as the gatekeeper, we've got Estella's cold and broken heart, we've got all these things which are sort of holding Pip back here. Now, Miss Havisham feeds off Estella like a kind of parasite. There's lots of language in this section of the text which is to do with sort of greed and hunger and being ravenous. So look out for those food-related words and that sort of lexical cluster in this chapter. And this is a chapter that's really relevant for reading that I mentioned at the start on exploitative parent-child relationships. This chapter goes really well with that bit of reading. So Pip can't escape his past. Orlick's presence is a haunting reminder of someone from his childhood who he sort of has that poor connection with. Jagger's behaviour also intrigues Pip when he comes to dinner, and it builds the mystery around Estella. This sense is building that there's something about her that we're going to find out. The same way that the unanswered question of who the person was who gave Pip these 2 £1 notes has just been answered, we sense we're going to find out answers to the Estella question, which would have kept readers buying the next instalment of All the Year Round. Notice in this chapter how they play a card game again. This time it's whist. And the sort of language of sort of keeping cards prisoner is used around sort of Jagger's. Think of Jagger's criminal connections as a lawyer. Remember how Pip and Estella used to play Beggar My Neighbour, and those card games were almost symbolic of life being like a card game, sort of taking risks, sort of trying to read other people's hand. So do a bit of reading about sort of card games and poker faces and see what connections you can make between the novel and those. And then finally we see older Pip's regret at his youthful decision not to visit Joe. So remember, our retrospective narrator is older Pip looking back, and he expresses his regret and his sort of shame at not visiting Joe when he should have done. In chapter 30 then, we see Pip sort of abusing his power as a gentleman. He asks for Orlick's removal as gatekeeper from Satis house. He tells Jaggers he doesn't trust him, and Jaggers says he'll see to it by paying Orlick off. And then Pip is humiliated in a really comic scene by Trabb's boy. So reread the commentary on top of page 37 of the York notes here. It's quite funny. Trabb's boy keeps sort of accidentally bumping into Pip in the street, sort of mocking him by sort of walking and talking and dressing in a particular way, saying, I don't know you, I don't recognise you. And then he'll run around the corner, sort of get ahead of Pip, come back through a side street and bump into him again. And this repeats 2 or 3 times. And Pip's completely sort of ashamed and embarrassed by this. And it's quite funny because Trabb is sort of performing and sort of playing a role, which is exactly what Pip is doing as a gentleman in London. He's performing the act of being a higher class than he actually is. And ultimately he uses his power of money to say to Mr. Trabb by letter, I'll no longer be using your business because your employee, humiliated me so much in the street. So he uses his wealth to sort of get back and get revenge on Mr. Trabb. He sends Joe a gift to appease his guilt. He feels guilty about not visiting him, so sends a gift to try and make up, but we know that that's a poor replacement for actually turning up yourself. Herbert warns Pip that Stella will make him unhappy about her cold heart, and she's only going to cause trouble for Pip. And Herbert has fallen in love with a poor, humble girl called Clara. Now, here we see the comparison between Pip and Herbert. Very similar characters, similar age, similar life conditions. Herbert's got no sort of delusions of grandeur. He's settling for, well, I say settling, that's quite rude. He's fallen in love for the sake of love with a humble girl. It doesn't matter that she's got no money and that they're unlikely to be able to marry, whereas Pip has sort of got his high aspirations of marrying this lady, Estella, who's sort of beyond his reach. And again, that phrase was delusions of grandeur. He believes he's so entitled to more than he really is. In chapter 31, we see this sort of comic interlude of Herbert and Pip going to see Wopsle play Hamlet. Now, Wopsle is kind of like a parallel character to Pip. He also has great expectations and wants to be a dramatic success in the playhouses of London. Now, his farcical and undistinguished performance in Hamlet mirrors Pip's performance as a gentleman. Wopsle doesn't realise the audience think that he's terrible and that they're barracking him and sort of booing him, and he thinks he's amazing. The same thing sort of happens for Pip. His performance as a gentleman, he thinks that he's amazing and that he's doing really well, but actually people see through him. And so there are lots of parallels between this novel and the play Hamlet. So obviously Dickens would have been a big fan of Shakespeare and has made those connections there. So if you know Hamlet, or if you read a summary of it, you'll be able to see some of those connections. And in your York notes as well, in here, there's some explanations as well. Don't want to dwell on that chapter for too long. So in chapter 32, Wemmick tours Pip around Newgate Prison, which is another link with his criminal guilt in the past that he can't escape. And we see Wemmick being very businesslike, very professional. And Estella writes and visits Pip in London, and her face stirs that buried memory that Pip can't quite place again. There's something troubling, there's something on his mind, but he can't quite figure out what it is. And this sense of mystery surrounding Estella is really building by this point in the book. We've had a long section in Volume 2 where nothing has really sort of happened. We haven't had any sort of action or any excitement. And so Dickens is building that tension and anticipation before we reach the climax of Magwitch's return in chapter 39. So Dickens needs people to keep buying the next instalment, and he's keeping all of these threads up in the air with that building sense of mystery, but we're certainly in a sort of lull within the novel here. We've not got sort of fast-paced and sort of lots of changing action. In chapter 33, Estella warns Pip against loving her. She knows that Miss Havisham has sort of trained her to be cold-hearted and sort of incapable of feeling love. But Pip, like many sort of hopeless men throughout history, is unable to distance himself from the temptations of loving her. And so he's sort of destined to be hurt. He drops her off in Richmond and returns with a heavy heart, as he thought they were sort of destined to be together, but realises that again, as with many things in the novel, he's misread the clues and he's got it wrong. And then finally, in this lesson today, chapter 34, this is a transition chapter. It's sort of moving us through. It's sort of a reflective chapter for Pip. That opening chapter on page 258 is one of self-reflection, and I'll just read it to you. Remember, this is the voice of older Pip. As I had grown accustomed to my expectations, I had insensibly begun to notice their effect upon myself and those around me. Their influence on my own character I disguised from my recognition as much as possible, but I knew very well that it was not all good. I lived in a state of chronic uneasiness respecting my behaviour to Joe. My conscience was not by any means comfortable about Biddy. When I woke up in the night, like Camilla, I used to think with a weariness in my spirits that I should have been happier and better if I'd never seen Miss Havisham's face, and had risen to manhood content to be partners with Joe in the honest old forge. Many a time of an evening, when I sat alone looking at the fire, I thought, after all, there was no fire like the forge fire and the kitchen fire at home. So Pip is reflecting at this stage. And Pip and Herbert in London, they decide to join this riotous dining club, the Finches of the Grove, with Startop and Drummle, and we see scenes of quite sort of horrific behaviour, which is very similar to the sort of 21st century activities you might have heard about. You might have heard of the Bullingdon Club, which was a club at sort of Oxbridge University, I think it was at Oxford University, that many of the sort of conservative politicians from recent years were part of, David Cameron, Boris Johnson, and they were quite sort of bawdy and bullies and sort of would destroy things and were quite sort of out of control. And we see a similar sort of thing here. And that's not gone away from our society, sort of gentlemen's clubs that are really quite nasty. Now, Pip and Herbert are in a dire financial situation, and in their sort of pleasure at their own actions, sort of thinking they're mature in sort of taking control of their finances, they overspend on a sort of lots of wine and dinner. And we get the humour on page 261 when older Pip retrospectively writes, "For there was something very comfortable in having plenty of stationery." Now, we all know that, don't we, when we've got work to do and we procrastinate by going to Paperchase and buying lots of stationery, and that makes us feel like we're being productive when actually we've not done anything yet. We then get news of Mrs. Joe's death right at the end of the chapter, and we see that in this chapter, Pip's gradual moral decline and his rising guilt about Joe, Biddy and Herbert and all these people who he's sort of letting down. And that's one of the key things we recognise through Pip's Bildungsroman, his novel of education, is that as he becomes a gentleman by money, his becoming a gentleman in nature is far delayed and is much, much further behind. And we see his, as he retrospectively tells the story, we see him slowly starting to realise and recognise what he needs to do to actually be a gentleman. So that takes us to the end of this section. Next time round, we'll be looking at chapters 35 to 39, which takes us to the end of volume 2, which will put us 2/3 of the way through the book. And that's when we reach the climax, Magwitch's return. And we'll do some work comparing this climax with the climax to The Great Gatsby, which is arguable where it is. Is it in the Plaza Hotel scene? Is it the moment Myrtle is run over and killed? Is it the moment that Gatsby is killed. So we'll be looking at comparing climaxes next time. So as I said, no essay this week, but I'd like you to do the tasks from back on the first slide, and please send me your notes, or send me a photograph of your notes, or just email me to say I'm up to date, I've done this reading and I've done these notes. And again, if you're struggling or if there's something I can help with, please do communicate. It's much easier to help you if you let me know your situation rather than me trying to guess through your silence whether that means you're getting on just fine or you're really struggling. So please do let me know. Okay, there's no deadline for this work, but it's ongoing work, and as you know, in a week or so there'll be the next section of the text to go through. So it's really important you keep up to date so that it doesn't all build up. Okay, I hope it's been comforting to have another lesson again and sort of hear my voice and see my face. Hopefully we'll be in school together again sometime soon, and I'll be able to help you out in person. Please do keep working hard, please don't let things slip, but at the same time look after yourself and make sure you're just doing a little bit at a time and not overloading yourselves. Okay, hope to see you all soon. Bye bye.